My husband called and said, "I inherited millions. Pack your things and get out." When I got home, the separation agreement was waiting. I read it, signed without a moment of hesitation, set the pen down, and smiled. "You're going to need all the luck you can get." The call came at 2:14 p.m. on a Thursday. I was elbow deep in a grant proposal for the literacy nonprofit I'd been running for 6 years. It was the kind of work that doesn't pay well, the kind of work that doesn't impress anyone at dinner parties. And it was the kind of work I did anyway, because I believed in it with every part of my being. My phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up. Thomas. I picked up on the second ring. I always picked up for Thomas. "I inherited millions," he said, just like that. There was no greeting, no build-up. His voice was the one he used in boardrooms. It was measured, declarative, a full step above everyone else in the room. "Pack your things and get out." I sat very still for a moment. Outside my office window, 2 kids were chasing a frisbee across Trinity Bellwoods Park. A golden retriever was winning. "Thomas," I said, my own voice calm and even. "The house is mine. It always has been. You know that." A pause followed. It wasn't an emotional pause. It was a logistical one, like he was consulting a checklist in his head. "I'll have someone collect the rest of your things by Friday if you're not done by then." The line went dead. I set my phone face down on the desk. I finished the paragraph I'd been writing about our new after-school reading program. Then I saved the document, closed my laptop, and drove home. My name is Nora Dempsey. I'm 41 years old. For 11 years, I was Thomas Sinclair's wife. And I had been waiting for this exact moment for 94 days. Let me back up. I met Thomas at a fundraising gala at the Art Gallery of Ontario. His commercial real estate company was one of our biggest donors. In retrospect, that tells you everything you need to know about the power dynamic we started with and never quite escaped. He was handsome in that way men are when they have always known they were handsome. Confident. He was funny too, but in a sharp, controlled way that could turn cutting if the mood of the room shifted against him. I thought it was intelligence. It took me years to understand the difference between intelligence and cruelty. We married after 2 years of dating. I kept my career. I kept my work in community development, a small organisation called Read on Toronto that I had helped build from a 3-person operation in a church basement to a staff of 22 and an annual budget of $1.4 million. Thomas worked in commercial real estate. He developed huge glass towers downtown that reshaped the city's skyline. He made real money, the kind of money that affords a house in Rosedale and a cottage in Muskoka. He was quietly, persistently dismissive of what I did. It wasn't cruel at first. It was more like the way you're dismissive of a hobby that has gotten a little out of hand. "It's good that you have your project," he used to say, his voice laced with a gentle condescension that I chose to interpret as affection. My project. The red flags were always there. I see that now, but I rationalize them. You do that when you're inside something. You do it when the thing you're rationalizing is also the thing that makes up your entire daily life. And you are, frankly, not ready to blow it all up just yet. He controlled the finances. I had a bank account for personal expenses. It was a generous one, I'll admit. I told myself that was normal. Lots of couples operated that way. He made decisions about the house unilaterally. He would re-landscape the entire garden or have the kitchen renovated while I was at a conference. He framed it as taking things off my plate. He had opinions about my friends, delivered as casual, harmless observations. "Don't you think Sarah drinks a little too much?" Or, "Michael seems a bit bitter about his career, doesn't he?" Slowly, I found myself seeing those friends less. It was just easier than navigating his observations afterward. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself we were fine. Then, 14 months ago, I noticed the phone. It started small. He'd always been private with his phone. That was normal, I reasoned. He was in business. There were deals that required discretion. But there is a difference between professional privacy and the particular kind of hyper-alertness that comes over someone when their phone is nearby and another person enters the room. I noticed the subtle angle shift of the screen, the way it would suddenly go dark, the way he'd step out onto the patio to take calls he used to take right in front of me. I told myself it was nothing. Then I found the hotel receipt. It wasn't dramatic. There was no lipstick on his collar, no scent of unfamiliar perfume. It was just a receipt from a boutique hotel in Kingston, Ontario. It was from a weekend Thomas had told me he was spending in Montreal at a real estate conference. I found it in his jacket pocket while I was gathering clothes for the dry cleaner. The name on the receipt was his. The dates were the dates he'd been gone. The conference in Montreal had been real. I checked. His assistant confirmed he'd attended Thursday to Saturday. He had been back by Sunday afternoon. The hotel receipt was for Monday and Tuesday. 2 extra days. A different city. Charged to a credit card I didn't recognize. My hands were very steady when I put the receipt back in his pocket. That frightened me more than the shaking would have. I didn't say anything. Not because I was afraid. Or not only because of that. It was because something had shifted in the back of my mind. A quiet, cold voice had spoken up. It said, "Wait, look first. Understand what you're actually dealing with before you make a move." So I waited, and I looked. The woman's name was Cara Sutton. I found this out not through any dramatic investigation. There was no hiring a private detective or following him through the city streets. It was just the patient, boring work of paying attention. A name that appeared in his shared digital calendar, lunch with CS. It appeared more frequently than any client lunch typically would. A charge from a high-end florist in Yorkville on a credit card statement I happened to see left on his desk. The particular quality of his distraction on certain evenings. He was physically present, but his mind was elsewhere, like a radio tuned to a frequency I couldn't hear. I did not confront him. Instead, I made an appointment with a lawyer. Her name was Margaret Dyson. She specialized in family law. She had 23 years of practice under her belt. She had the specific, unsentimental clarity of a woman who has sat across from thousands of people in the worst moments of their lives and has learned how to help them think anyway. Her office was on the 14th floor of a building on Bay Street. I remember looking out her window at the Toronto skyline, the CN Tower standing like a silent sentinel, while she reviewed the information I'd brought her. I thought, I built a life here. I built something real. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice calm and direct. And I did. I told her about the 11 years of marriage, about his financial control, about the phone, the hotel receipt, the name in the calendar. I told her about his dismissiveness, the way he made me feel small, the way he called my life's work, my project. She listened without any change in her expression. When I finished, she set down her pen and folded her hands on the polished mahogany desk. "You're being very careful, Nora," she said. It wasn't a question. I'm trying to be. "Good." She paused, her eyes meeting mine. "I need you to continue being careful. Do not confront him. Do not move any money. Do not give him any indication that you are preparing for anything. Can you do that for me?" "Yes," I said, my voice firm. "There's something else," Margaret said, her tone shifting slightly. "You mentioned his father passed away recently." 8 months ago, a heart attack. And the estate. I don't know the details. Thomas handled all of it. He just said it was complicated. She looked at me steadily, a thoughtful expression on her face. I'd like to have a forensic accountant review whatever financial disclosures we can access before he makes any moves. I have a feeling your husband's definition of complicated might be different from ours. I just nodded. I was putting my future in her hands. In the meantime, she said, her voice turning crisp again, document everything, every conversation, every trip, every receipt you find. Create a timeline. Be meticulous. I went home and started documenting everything. The forensic accountant's name was Robert Cooley. He was a CPA, a certified fraud examiner, with 15 years of experience doing exactly this kind of work. The kind of work where someone needs to know exactly where the money went and why the story they're being told doesn't add up. Margaret referred him to me. He was quiet, methodical, and had the specific patience of a man who understood that financial fraud is rarely theatrical. It's mostly just paperwork, if you know where to look. He found the offshore account in 11 days. It wasn't a massive sum, not by the standards of Thomas's business. It was $430,000, moved in 3 separate transfers over the past 14 months. It was sent to an account in the Cayman Islands. The account was registered to a holding company with a meaningless name, LCH Investments, LLC. This isn't entirely unusual for someone in commercial real estate, Nora, Robert told me over the phone. He had a careful, neutral voice that I found incredibly reassuring. But the timing is interesting. The timing? I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The first transfer was made 6 days after his father's estate was opened for probate. I sat with that information for a long moment. I was in my car, parked in the underground garage of my office building. The concrete walls felt like they were closing in. Robert continued. His father left him money, a significant amount, based on what I've been able to pull from public records. The estate is still in process. There are assets being liquidated, but the preliminary valuation suggests we're talking about something in the range of $2 to $3 million. I stared at the concrete wall in front of me. He's hiding it, I said, the words coming out in a whisper. It appears he's moving marital assets offshore, Robert corrected gently, before the inheritance, which is his separate property, comes through. He's clearing the decks before the divorce he may be planning. He was planning this before I even knew anything was wrong. That's what the timeline suggests, Robert confirmed. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat in my car in the quiet of the parking garage for about 6 minutes. I just focused on my breathing, in and out. I wasn't at the crying stage yet. I was at the other stage, the one that feels like plunging into ice-cold water, the one where everything becomes very clear and very still, and you understand with perfect chilling precision what you are dealing with. Thomas had been planning to leave me. He had another woman. He had money he was hiding from me. And he had been moving all the pieces into position for over a year. All while I brought him coffee in the morning and asked about his day and went to bed next to him every single night, believing that the distance between us was a valley that could still be crossed. I called Margaret. "We need to move faster," I said, the moment she picked up. "I know," she said, her voice calm as ever. "I've been watching the estate filings. He's about to receive a large disbursement." "How large?" "The final accounting isn't complete, but Robert's preliminary estimate is $2.1 million, net of taxes." I almost laughed. It was a harsh, brittle sound. I pressed my lips together instead. "He's going to use the inheritance as his exit strategy," I said. "He gets the money, He's financially independent from our shared assets, and then he pulls the trigger on the divorce. That's my read on the situation as well, she agreed. So, the question is, what do we do? Margaret was quiet for a moment. I could hear the faint sound of city traffic through her phone. We let him, she said finally. She explained it to me over the next 30 minutes. She laid out the strategy with the precision of a master chess player. In Ontario, marital assets, or what's called net family property, are subject to equalisation. The key word was family. Assets acquired before the marriage or received as inheritance were generally considered separate property, excluded from the calculation. If Thomas received his inheritance cleanly as his own separate asset, I would have no claim to it. Unless. There were always exceptions. Unless assets had been commingled. Unless he had transferred family property to offshore accounts in anticipation of a separation. That is called dissipation of assets. And it is very much the kind of thing courts take seriously. He's been moving money, I said, the pieces clicking into place. Exactly. And if we can document the dissipation of family property, which Robert has already largely done, the court has a basis to give you an unequal division of the remaining property to compensate you for it. The house, I whispered. The house, his business interests, 11 years of marital contributions. I thought about that word, contributions. 11 years of hosting his clients for dinners that I cooked and planned. 11 years of adjusting my schedule around his constant travel. Of turning down a national director position with a literacy organisation 3 years ago because the role required a move to Ottawa and Thomas didn't want to leave Toronto. My project. There's something else, Margaret said, pulling me from my thoughts. I spoke with a colleague who specialises in financial fraud, a woman named Diane Voss. She's provided expert testimony in 3 major divorce cases involving hidden assets. I'd like her to review Robert's findings before we proceed. When we walk into that mediation, I want our case to be ironclad. I want him to feel ambushed. Good, I said, and I meant it. She was quiet for a beat. Then, with something that might have been the beginning of a smile in her voice, she said, "Yes, I suppose that's the point, isn't it?" The call came 94 days after I first walked into Margaret's office, 2:14 p.m. on a Thursday. I inherited millions. Pack your things and get out. I drove home through the late afternoon traffic on the Don Valley Parkway. The separation agreement was on the kitchen table. It was neatly stacked, tabbed in 3 colours with little yellow adhesive arrows, pointing to the signature lines. His lawyer had done meticulous work. I could appreciate the craftsmanship, even as I understood what it was designed to do. Annihilate me. Thomas was not home. He had done this by phone, which told me everything I needed to know about how he expected this to go. He expected it to be easy. He expected me to be the woman he had spent 11 years making smaller. The woman with her little project and her generous personal account and her quiet, endless adjustments to his life. I sat down at the kitchen table. I read every single page, all 43 of them. I made notes in the margins with a pencil, just as Margaret had taught me. She had prepared me for what to look for. The lowball valuation of his business, the omission of certain accounts, the neat, tidy narrative of an amicable split where he walked away with everything that mattered. Then I picked up the pen. I signed every page, every line. I set the pen down. I looked at the stack of papers that represented the end of my marriage. Then I texted Margaret. He served me. I've signed. See you at mediation. Her response came 30 seconds later. Good. Robert and Diane will be ready. See you Tuesday. I got up from the table. I made myself a cup of tea. Earl Grey. I sat at the kitchen counter, my kitchen counter, the one with the quartz countertop I'd picked out and had installed and refinished twice, and I drank it slowly. When Thomas came home at 6:40, I was reading a book on the couch in the living room. He stopped dead in the doorway when he saw me. He was holding a bottle of expensive champagne, a celebratory bottle. "I expected you to be gone," he said, his voice a little unsteady. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I said, not looking up from my book. I turned a page. I just wanted to make sure I had everything packed. He looked past me, at the signed papers on the kitchen table. Something shifted in his face. It wasn't exactly relief. It was the relaxation of someone who has braced for a fight and has just discovered they're not getting one. "Nora," he said, his voice changing, shifting to the warm, reasonable tone he used to use back in the beginning. This doesn't have to be." I looked up at him then, and I let him see the smile on my face. "Thomas," I said, my voice clear and bright, "you're going to need all the luck you can get." He frowned, the confident posture faltering for just a second. "What does that mean?" I just smiled again. "See you Tuesday." The mediation suite was on the 9th floor of an office building near the courthouse. It was a study in corporate neutrality. Neutral furniture, neutral walls, a long, polished table that was designed to be nobody's territory. Thomas arrived with his attorney, a man named Preston Lyle. He was a junior partner at a large firm on Bay Street who had the specific energy of a man who believed strongly in the sound of his own voice. Expensive suit, confident stride. He set his briefcase on the table with a loud snap that was meant to establish something. Thomas was wearing a tie I'd given him for his birthday 2 years ago. A handsome navy silk from Harry Rosen. I don't think he remembered that. Margaret sat beside me, calm and composed. Across from her sat Robert Cooley in a simple grey suit, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. In front of him was a folder that was 3 inches thick. Beside Robert sat Diane Voss, the expert financial analyst. She had the specific stillness of someone who has been in rooms like this many times and is never, ever nervous. Thomas looked at Robert and Diane, and then he looked at me. A flicker of something crossed his face. It wasn't quite alarm. Not yet. It was confusion. Preston Lyle opened his folder. "Given my client's recently acquired inheritance and the existing asset structure, we're seeking a distribution that reflects." Margaret slid a document across the table. It landed in front of Preston with a soft, definitive thud. Preston stopped talking. It was Robert's full report. 47 pages, tabbed and indexed, with every single transfer documented. Amounts, dates, destination accounts, cross-referenced against marital financial records. LCH Investments LLC was on page 4, with a footnote that identified the Cayman Islands account and the 3 transfers totaling $430,000. Preston looked at it. His professional, confident expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Thomas picked up the document. He read the first page, then the second. Then he set it down very slowly and looked at me. "The dissipation of family property is documented in full, Mr. Lyle," Margaret said, her voice even. "Transfers initiated 14 months ago, 6 days after the estate was opened for probate. Our position is that Mr. Sinclair anticipated and planned for this separation well in advance of serving papers and systematically moved family funds offshore in anticipation of that." "That's a significant claim," Preston said carefully, his bluster gone. "Diane?" Margaret nodded. Diane Voss opened her own folder and walked them through the numbers. She had the unhurried precision of someone who has done this in courtrooms and is not intimidated by conference rooms. She named every transfer. She connected every date. She explained in terms that required no legal training to understand exactly what the timeline showed and exactly what it meant. Preston leaned over and said something quietly to Thomas. Thomas just shook his head, his face pale. "I'd also like to note," Margaret continued, her voice cutting through the tense silence, "that we have documentation of the inheritance's anticipated value during the marriage, and that certain estate assets may be subject to a claim based on actions taken during the marriage to manage and maintain the relationship with the decedent." She paused for effect. Specifically, the relationship between Ms. Dempsey and her father-in-law, Walter Sinclair. A relationship which she maintained independently and consistently throughout the marriage. Thomas looked up sharply. His eyes were wide. "What?" "Your father," I said quietly, speaking for the first time. His eyes stayed on me. "I drove him to his oncology appointments at Sunnybrook," I said, my voice steady. "For 4 years. When you were traveling for work, which was often, I brought him his groceries. I called him twice a week to check in. I was there the night he fell, and we had to take him to the emergency room. You were in Phoenix. I sat in that hospital with him for 6 hours. I was there." I held his gaze across the polished table. "He told me once that he didn't know what he'd do without me. He said it more than once." Thomas's jaw was very tight. The muscle in his cheek was jumping. "We're not making a claim on the full inheritance," Margaret said smoothly. "We're claiming an equitable equalization of family assets, full compensation for the documented dissipation, and an adjustment that reflects 11 years of contributions, financial and otherwise, to this marriage." Preston Lyle was writing furiously on a legal pad. He stopped writing and looked at Thomas. "I'd like a moment with my client." "Of course," Margaret said, leaning back in her chair. They stepped outside into the hallway. I sat back in my chair. My hands were folded in my lap, completely steady. Robert caught my eye across the table and gave me a small, professional nod. It communicated nothing, and yet somehow it communicated everything. Margaret leaned close. "You okay?" "Yes," I said. "He's going to be angry." "I know. He's going to say you ambushed him." "I know that too," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "You did everything right, Nora." Preston and Thomas came back 10 minutes later. Thomas sat down. He stared at the table, not at me. The confident stride was still there. That kind of posture is just muscle memory. But something essential behind it had gone quiet. "My client would like to propose a settlement figure," Preston said, his voice flat. The number he named was significantly higher than what Thomas had originally intended to offer in his agreement. It was not the number Margaret was prepared to accept. It took 3 more hours. At the end of those 3 hours, we had an agreement. The house. Thomas could keep the house. I didn't want it. Not anymore. I didn't want that version of my life. But I received a clean, fair cash settlement. A settlement that reflected the dissipated assets, the marital contributions, the 11 years. It was enough to fund Red on Toronto's operating budget for 2 full years and still leave me standing on my own 2 feet. Thomas signed the final page. He stood up, buttoned his jacket, and looked at me across the table. "You planned this," he said, his voice low and bitter. "You planned yours first," I replied softly. His mouth tightened. "It didn't have to be this way." "No," I agreed. "It really didn't." Preston put a hand on his arm. Thomas shook it off. It was the exact same gesture I had imagined in my head for months. The gesture of a man who has realized, far too late, that the room has changed around him and he no longer knows its dimensions. He walked out. The door closed behind him. The sound it made was very small and very final. there's an epilogue. There always is. 6 months later, Red on Toronto launched a new after-school program in 3 additional communities. We hired 4 new staff members. I stood at the ribbon cutting for our new downtown location, a real space, not a borrowed church basement. And I shook hands and gave a small speech and meant every single word of it. Thomas and Cara Sutton moved to Vancouver. I know this because mutual acquaintances mention it occasionally. They say it in that careful way people do when they're testing to see if you still care. I don't particularly. I hope he's happy. I mean that without irony and without warmth. It's just the distant, clean neutrality of someone who has fully and completely let go of a thing. Margaret Dyson sent me a bottle of wine when the settlement cleared. The note said, "You stayed calm when it mattered. That's why you won." I put the note on my refrigerator. I still look at it sometimes. Robert Cooley's forensic report was eventually shared with the Canada Revenue Agency. The offshore account turned out to have reporting implications that Preston Lyle's firm had apparently not fully considered. I didn't initiate that referral. Margaret made a call that she was ethically required to make. What happened after that was between Thomas and federal disclosure requirements. I don't lose sleep over it. The thing I think about most, actually, isn't Thomas. It's a Tuesday afternoon, about 8 weeks after the settlement. I went back to the probate records online to understand the full picture of Walter Sinclair's estate. It was out of professional curiosity, or something like it. Walter had written a note. It wasn't a legal document, just a note, handwritten on plain paper. It was found with the will and entered into the probate record as a personal statement. The estate lawyer had read it at the proceedings, which Thomas had attended alone. Margaret got me a copy. Walter had written about the visits, the appointments, the groceries, the phone calls. He wrote about the 6 hours in an emergency room while his son was in Phoenix. "Nora made me feel like I mattered to someone," he wrote. "Not because she had to, but because she chose to. I want that acknowledged." He had left a separate provision in his will. It was a small one, a personal bequest, specifically to me. Thomas's lawyers had quietly buried it in the probate complexity. It was one of the things Robert had found. It wasn't a fortune. It was $40,000, with a note that said, "For Nora's work. She knows the kind I mean." I sat with that document for a long time. Thomas had thrown away 11 years of a marriage. He'd thrown away whatever good thing we might have salvaged. He did it for money, and for another woman, and for the particular blindness of a man who looks at someone and sees only what they've always let him see. His father had looked at me and seen what I actually was. I donated half of the $40,000 to Read on Toronto's endowment fund in Walter Sinclair's name. The other half I put toward a down payment on a condo in Leslieville. It has big windows and a kitchen I chose all by myself. The morning I moved in, I made coffee and stood at the window and looked out at the city. I'd built something real here. I still was.